The midday hum of the restaurant was alive with the clink of cutlery, the muted thump of polished shoes against marble, and the rising-falling murmur of conversations that seemed to blend into a single soft roar. A delicate chandelier cast warm light over white tablecloths, each table a small island of celebration or connection. But in the far corner, where the glow seemed to fade, sat Rebecca Vaughn. She was small for her age, her 11th birthday crown, a paper one from the restaurant's staff, sitting slightly crooked over her light brown hair. A wheelchair framed her slight frame, its chrome catching occasional glints of light as waiters passed by. In front of her, a slice of chocolate cake rested on a pristine plate, a single candle poised in the center. The candle's tiny flame wavered from the faint gusts of air every time the main door opened, threatening to snuff out entirely. Rebecca stared at it, but didn't move. She knew she could blow it out any time, but something about doing it alone made the act feel hollow. Her gaze drifted to the other tables, clusters of people laughing, leaning toward one another, forks stealing bites from each other's plates. The sound of their joy seemed to make the silence around her sharper, almost echoing inside her. She wasn't truly alone. Technically, her caregiver, Marlene, had been seated beside her earlier, smiling and making small talk. But just as the cake arrived, Marlene's phone had rung. With a quick, apologetic glance, she had stepped outside to take the call. Rebecca had nodded that it was fine. She was used to adults leaving when urgent things came up. She just hadn't expected it to happen on her birthday. Her mother, Eleanor Vaughn, had meant to be there. That had been the plan, a special lunch, just the two of them. Rebecca had even picked the restaurant herself. But Eleanor's assistant had called earlier that morning to say an emergency meeting had come up. A high-profile investor from Dubai had flown in unexpectedly, and Eleanor, the CEO of one of the country's fastest-growing tech firms, had to take it. She'd promised she would join as soon as she could. Rebecca had nodded when Marlene relayed the message, but the disappointment had been a heavy, unspoken thing pressing against her chest all morning. She tried to push it away by imagining her mom walking in any minute, all smiles, saying how proud she was. But the longer she sat, the more the imagined moments started to fade. A waiter passed by and glanced toward her table, his smile quick and polite. She returned it with a faint nod, then looked down again. She picked up her fork, broke off a small piece of cake, and let it rest on the plate. It was strange. She'd been excited for this cake all week, but now, even its rich scent wasn't enough to make her hungry. Somewhere across the room, a small burst of laughter drew her attention. It came from a table near the center, where a man with warm brown skin and close-cropped hair sat with a boy who looked about 6. The boy was animated, his hands moving as if acting out a story, while the man listened with genuine amusement. Rebecca didn't know why she kept watching, but something about the way they leaned in toward each other, completely present, made her chest ache. She looked away quickly, embarrassed, but when her eyes drifted back a few moments later, she realized the man had noticed her. His gaze was steady but kind, not the curious or pitying look she was used to from strangers. He gave the smallest nod, an acknowledgement, before turning back to the boy. Rebecca's fingers fidgeted with the paper crown on her head. She told herself it didn't matter. Strangers didn't walk over to join lonely kids in restaurants. That wasn't how the world worked. She was fine. She was always fine. And yet, there was something about that glance, about the way the boy had leaned in earlier, and whispered something to his father, that made her wonder if maybe, just maybe, today might not end the way it had started. The restaurant's hum carried on. The low conversations, the occasional burst of laughter, the clatter of silverware. But Rebecca's mind had begun to drift, the sound blurring into a background haze. The flame on her cake's candle had burned low now, the wax pooling at the base in soft, melting folds. She watched it sway gently, imagining it giving up before she could make her wish. Across the room, Malik Thompson sat forward slightly in his chair. He'd been listening to Jordan tell a story about the playground at school, but his gaze kept returning to the corner where the girl in the wheelchair sat. There was something in her expression. The kind of quiet sadness you didn't notice unless you'd seen it before. Malik had, He'd seen it in the faces of kids left out at recess, in hospital waiting rooms where laughter felt out of place, in his late sister's eyes on the days when even the strongest smile wasn't enough. Jordan, oblivious to his father's shifting focus, tugged at Malik's sleeve and leaned in close. "She looks lonely, Dad," he whispered, his voice carrying the innocent certainty of a child who believed problems were meant to be fixed. Malik glanced at his son, then back at the girl. He didn't pause to overthink it. Some moments you didn't weigh against social norms or second guess, you just acted. He stood, his tall frame moving easily through the narrow gap between tables, Jordan scampering after him with quick, eager steps. Rebecca noticed them halfway across the room. Her first instinct was to look down, her fingers tightening around the armrest of her chair. Strangers approaching could mean pity, or awkward questions, or the kind of exaggerated cheer adults sometimes used when they didn't know how to talk to her. But when Malik reached her table, there was nothing rehearsed in his smile. It was warm and open, the kind that made you feel like he'd known you longer than the 3 seconds he'd been standing there. "Mind if we join you?" he asked gently, his voice steady and without pity. Jordan peered around his father's side, giving a small, encouraging grin. Rebecca hesitated. She didn't know these people. But there was something about the way Malik waited, not rushing her, not filling the silence, that made her feel in control of the choice. Finally, she gave the faintest nod. Malik pulled out the chair opposite her, helping Jordan climb into the one beside him. The moment they sat, Jordan leaned forward, his eyes fixed on the cake. "Is it your birthday?" he asked with the unfiltered directness only children could get away with. Rebecca nodded again, this time a little less shyly. 11, she murmured. Jordan's face lit up as if that were the best news he'd heard all day. Malik's smile widened. "That's worth celebrating properly," he said, glancing at the still-burning candle. "You haven't blown it out yet?" Rebecca shook her head. "Didn't feel like it." Malik tilted his head. Maybe it just needed more people to help sing. And just like that, without ceremony or awkwardness, the three of them began to hum the familiar tune. Malik's voice was warm and sure, Jordan's was high and a little off-key, and Rebecca found herself smiling despite the lump that had lodged itself in her throat. She drew in a deep breath, closed her eyes for a moment and blew. The candle's flame trembled, then disappeared in a faint curl of smoke. Jordan clapped as if she'd just won a prize. Malik grinned, picking up his fork. "Now, the only rule is we all have to try the cake." For the first time all afternoon, Rebecca's laugh came easily. Not the small, polite kind, but the sort that made her eyes brighten. The lonely corner of the restaurant no longer felt quite so far from the rest of the world. The cake was rich and sweet, its chocolate layers soft against the fork. But it wasn't the taste that made Rebecca's shoulders ease for the first time that day. It was the sound. Jordan's small bursts of laughter when Malik teased him about taking the biggest bite. Malik's easy chuckle when Rebecca shyly cracked a joke about the restaurant's overly fancy napkins. The gentle rhythm of conversation that didn't feel forced, didn't feel like someone was speaking to her out of obligation. Rebecca had been in enough situations to know the difference between politeness and presence. Malik and Jordan were fully here. Jordan leaned toward her with conspiratorial energy, as if they were co-plotters in something secret. "Want to hear the best riddle ever?" he asked, his eyes wide. Without waiting for an answer, he launched into it. "What has hands but can't clap?" Rebecca's brow furrowed in thought. She was used to adults giving her plenty of time to answer, but Jordan just sat, grinning, letting her think without rushing her. "A clock," she said finally, a small proud smile tugging at her lips. Jordan threw his hands up. "You're good." He looked to Malik. "She got it way faster than you did, Dad." Malik pretended to wince. "That's because she's clearly smarter than me." He gave Rebecca a little nod of respect, and she felt a warmth spread in her chest that had nothing to do with the hot chocolate she'd ordered earlier. They went back and forth like that. Jordan telling silly riddles. Malik sharing tiny, funny stories about his son's misadventures at the grocery store. Rebecca responding with her own small details about school, about her favorite books. Malik never once glanced at her wheelchair. He didn't tilt his head with that subtle pity people thought she didn't notice. He just saw her. When Malik excused himself briefly to flag down a waiter, Jordan leaned in again. "You're nice," he said matter-of-factly. "Most grown-ups don't talk to me and my dad at restaurants." Rebecca tilted her head. "Why not?" Jordan shrugged in that way only a 6-year-old could, as if the reasons adults had for excluding people were both obvious and ridiculous. "Maybe 'cause we're different." He said it with no bitterness, just a simple truth. Rebecca didn't respond right away. She thought of how often she'd been stared at, or ignored, or treated like a fragile ornament instead of a person. Maybe Jordan was right. Maybe different was just something that made other people uncomfortable. Malik returned then, sliding a small plate of cookies onto the table. "For Jordan," he said, "but only if he shares." Rebecca smiled as Jordan eagerly offered her one first. She took it, breaking it neatly in half and placing the other piece back on his plate. The three of them ate slowly, conversation weaving between them like a thread stitching something unseen but strong. She didn't notice Marlene returning from outside until the caregiver touched her shoulder lightly and murmured an apology. Rebecca simply nodded, her eyes returning to Malik and Jordan. It was strange how quickly strangers could become not strangers. For the first time in months, she wasn't watching the clock, waiting for something else to begin. She was already in the middle of something worth remembering. The restaurant's energy had shifted for Rebecca. The low murmur of voices and clinking glasses no longer felt like a wall pressing in, but more like a background melody she could almost hum along to. Malik and Jordan's presence had pulled her into the rhythm of the room, the three of them creating a small island of warmth amid the bustle. But across the room, at the tall glass doors, the tempo of her world was about to change again. Eleanor Vaughn stepped inside with the precision of someone used to entering a boardroom. Her heels clicked sharply against the marble, her tailored navy blazer catching the afternoon light in a way that made heads turn, not because she was trying to be noticed, but because she carried herself like someone who always was. In one hand, she clutched her phone, thumbs still swiping across the glowing screen, in the other, a slim leather briefcase. The maitre d' greeted her with a subtle bow of the head. She nodded back without slowing her pace. Her eyes scanned the room automatically, and froze. There was her daughter, but not as Eleanor had pictured her during the meeting. Not sitting quietly, waiting, not staring at the candle in silence. Instead, Rebecca was leaning forward in her wheelchair, her birthday crown slipping slightly as she laughed at something the little boy beside her had just said. Across from her, a man Eleanor didn't recognize was smiling. Not politely, not in that careful way strangers often did with children, but with an ease that suggested this was far from their first conversation. Eleanor's first instinct was a tightening in her chest, protective, wary. Who was this man? Why was he sitting with her daughter? She approached slowly, her mind already drafting polite but firm questions. But as she drew closer, something in her step softened. She caught the tail end of a joke, Jordan's triumphant grin as Rebecca high-fived him. Malik's quiet chuckle as if simply watching them was enough. The tension in Eleanor's shoulders loosened, though not entirely. Malik noticed her before Rebecca did. He looked up, meeting her gaze with the steady calm of someone who had nothing to hide. Standing, he extended a hand. "You must be Eleanor," he said, his tone respectful but warm. "I'm Malik Thompson. This is my son Jordan. We saw Rebecca sitting alone and thought, well, birthdays aren't meant to be spent that way." Eleanor hesitated before taking his hand. She was used to introductions that came with agendas, networking, potential deals, strategic exchanges. This one felt startlingly simple. Still, her CEO's mind searched for subtext. Rebecca turned toward her then, her smile wide and unguarded in a way Eleanor hadn't seen in months. "Mom," she said, "this is Malik and Jordan. They made my birthday fun." Eleanor glanced between them. Malik's eyes held no trace of pity, no patronizing glint, just sincerity. Jordan waved shyly before biting into a cookie. The moment was so ordinary it almost felt foreign to Eleanor's carefully curated life. She took the empty seat beside Rebecca, setting her phone face down for the first time all day. "Well," she said softly, more to herself than to anyone else, "I'm glad someone made sure you weren't alone." Rebecca's hand brushed against hers under the table, a small, almost accidental gesture. But it told Eleanor more than any meeting note or quarterly report ever could. The waiter slipped away after refilling their water glasses, leaving the four of them in a small pocket of quiet within the restaurant's steady hum. Eleanor sat back, her blazer draped neatly over the back of her chair now, her briefcase tucked out of sight beneath the table. She'd told herself she was only staying for a few minutes, long enough to be polite, to thank Malik for his kindness, but something in the way Rebecca kept glancing at him and Jordan, her eyes bright and unguarded, made Eleanor linger. Malik listened more than he spoke at first, letting Jordan chatter about school, about how he was practically the fastest runner in his class, about a cat in their neighborhood who always stole socks from people's porches. Rebecca laughed, chiming in with a story about how their own cat had once knocked an entire pitcher of lemonade onto her mom's laptop. Eleanor gave a rueful smile at that, remembering the chaos of that afternoon. It wasn't until the conversation lulled that Malik leaned back, his gaze steady on Eleanor. "I hope you don't mind me saying this," he began, "but I think Rebecca is a pretty remarkable kid." Eleanor's eyes softened despite herself. "She is," she said quietly, the pride in her voice edged with something else. Something unspoken. Malik nodded toward Rebecca, who was now trying to coax Jordan into wearing her paper crown. "I run a community youth program," he said, "after-school activities for kids, mostly in neighborhoods where families can't afford private lessons or camps. A few years back, we started a branch specifically for kids with disabilities. My sister, she had cerebral palsy. Growing up, she was my best friend. Smart, funny, more patient than I ever managed to be." He paused, his smile fading just slightly at the edges. "But she hated how people looked at her. Like she was a charity project. Or worse, invisible. She once told me the best gift anyone ever gave her was time. Real time. The kind where you're not half thinking about something else, where you're actually there." Eleanor felt something shift inside her. The words landed like a quiet truth she'd been trying not to hear. Malik's eyes were calm but unwavering. "I guess that's why I came over. I saw a kid sitting alone on her birthday and I thought, that's not how the day should go." Rebecca was laughing again now, placing the crown squarely on Jordan's head while he pretended to pout. The scene was so simple, 2 kids, a paper crown, a plate of crumbs. But Eleanor realized how rarely she'd been present for moments like it. She'd been there for the big gestures, the gifts, the special trips, the carefully scheduled events. But too often she'd been missing for the small, unscripted ones. "I work too much," she admitted suddenly, the words surprising her even as they left her mouth. Malik didn't rush to reassure her or offer platitudes. He just nodded, as if acknowledging a truth that didn't need softening. For a few moments, they sat in a comfortable silence, the kind that didn't demand to be filled. Eleanor glanced at her phone on the table, silent, dark, and left it there. Jordan broke the quiet, holding the crown toward her. "Want to wear it?" he asked with complete sincerity. Eleanor laughed, shaking her head. "I think it looks better on you." But when Rebecca's hand slipped into hers under the table again, Eleanor squeezed it back. This time, not absent-mindedly, but with intention. 2 weeks later, the Vaughn household looked different. Not in its architecture or decor, but in its atmosphere. The glass-walled home office where Eleanor usually spent late nights now sat empty more often. The steady ping of her phone in the evenings had gone quiet, and Rebecca, who had grown used to the sound of her mother's voice echoing down hallways as she spoke into headsets, now heard it closer, warmer, and softer, reading aloud from the couch, asking about homework, or laughing over a baking experiment that ended in flour on the floor. Malik's number was saved in Eleanor's phone now, though she had memorized it after the first few calls. They'd met twice more since that lunch, once for hot chocolate after school, once for a Saturday park day that turned into an impromptu picnic when Jordan convinced them all to try frisbee. Eleanor watched the easy camaraderie between Malik and Rebecca grow, the same way she saw her own daughter's smile grow less guarded each time. But the biggest shift came when Eleanor visited Malik's community center for the first time. She'd been expecting something small, a few rooms, maybe a gym. What she found was a space alive with energy, walls painted in bright murals, shelves stacked with games and art supplies, a wheelchair basketball game in full swing in the main hall. Kids of all abilities were there. Some in wheelchairs, some using canes, some running barefoot across the padded floor. Their laughter and shouts blending into one joyful hum. Malik walked her through, introducing her not as a CEO, but as Rebecca's mom. That title, she realized, meant more to her than any corporate one she'd ever held. They found a quiet corner, and Eleanor surprised herself by saying, "I want to help. Not with just a donation. I want to make sure this keeps growing." Malik studied her for a moment, as if weighing her sincerity, then smiled. "Then let's get to work." A year later, on Rebecca's 12th birthday, the celebration wasn't at an upscale restaurant. It was in that same community center, now twice its original size, filled with balloons and music. Long tables were lined with food, some catered, some clearly made by parents and volunteers. In the center of the room, Rebecca sat at a table surrounded by friends, some from school, some from Malik's program, with Jordan at her side, already plotting which games they'd play after cake. Eleanor stood beside Malik near the doorway, watching as Rebecca closed her eyes and blew out the candles. This time, there were no flickering flames struggling alone, no untouched plates, no empty chairs. Malik leaned toward her slightly. "Better than last year?" Eleanor smiled, her eyes never leaving her daughter. "Better than I ever could have planned." Rebecca looked up just then, catching her mother's gaze. She grinned, and in that moment, Eleanor understood the truth Malik had been living by all along, that the greatest gift you could give someone wasn't found in a store or measured in dollars. It was in the time you chose to be there. And this year, they were all here.